Hello and welcome to Unpacking Terms. The term I'm going to be unpacking today is recast. And what I'll present here is a simplified, very summarized version of the abundant work on recast by several SLA scholars, including Long, Ellis, Sheen, Lowen, and Mackey. So what is a recast? A recast is a type of oral corrective feedback which consists of a total or partial reformulation of the part that wasn't quite right and that needs some adjustments in terms of its form, and many times it is triggered by a breakdown in communication, but not always. And I'll show you examples in a minute. A recast is input providing feedback. It is also relatively unobtrusive, and this is why many educators tend to like them. You can provide corrective feedback without interrupting the flow of communication. Traditionally, we tend to think of recast as implicit. However, there are many different types of recasts and they can be made more or less explicit. And I like this quote from Ellis and Sheen because it definitely captures the variety of recasts that there are out there. Recasts are just one flower among many, and to extend this metaphor, they are a very varied species of flora. So let's look at some different ways in which recast can happen. The first one is straightforward reformulation. So if a learner says, I need go homework, the reformulation, the recast would be, I need to do homework. Another way that the reformulation can happen would be for the interlocutor to say something like, you need to do homework. Now, some might argue that these examples with straight reformulation are still interrupting the flow of communication. And so what would be a more subtle way of providing the correction without interrupting the flow of communication? It would be something along the lines of this. You need to do homework, a lot of homework, and then we continue on with the conversation. So we provided the reformulation, but the conversation keeps going. Another similar possibility would be to put a little bit more emphasis on the go homework part and say something like, go homework? Oh, you need to do homework. Yes, a lot of homework, and then the conversation keeps going. Compared to the previous one, this makes it a little bit more explicit. The correction is a little bit more obvious. There's another type of recast called a partial recast, and that is when only part of the utterance is reformulated. So in this case, it would be something like, to do homework. Recasts certainly provide learners with positive evidence, that is, what is possible in the language. The question is, do they provide negative evidence? Do they let the learners know what is not possible in the language? It all depends on how the learner interprets the recast. In the more subtle or implicit forms of recasts, the learner might not even realize that what they said is different from the reformulated version. And so in that case, it is questionable whether recasts are providing negative evidence. Does that matter? That's another big question that we need to answer. Well, for some scholars like Lydia White, Michael Long, negative evidence could facilitate acquisition of certain contrasts, certain differences between the two languages. Of course, not all scholars agree with respect to the role, if any, of negative evidence. Recasts have a lot of positive qualities, mainly the fact that they are input providing and that they can be done without interrupting the flow of communication. On the other hand, there are some concerns surrounding recasts. One of them is that they may go unnoticed. So for example, if a learner says, I need go homework, and you say, oh, you need to do homework, the learner might simply say, yes, responding to your question without even noticing any differences between what they said and what you said. The other concern is that they may actually lead to misunderstandings. For example, in this case, if a learner says, I know going, and you recast, I'm not going, the learner might think you are just saying that you're not going either. And usually what happens after this is what? You resort to more explicit correction. Now you start clarifying what you meant, and that definitely interrupts the flow of communication. In terms of the effectiveness of recast, there's been a lot of studies published, and we will unpack at least one of those articles soon. But why is it so hard to draw clear conclusions regarding the effectiveness of recasts? Well, because there are several factors that may affect their effectiveness. One of them is salience. It's not always easy to notice that we made a change in the utterance, and so how salient is the target form that we are reformulating? Another is whether what we are reformulating is something completely new or unknown versus something that is partially known, that the learner sort of knew it already. And the third one would be developmental readiness. And this is a big one, and it is difficult for teachers to control this, because how do you know exactly when a learner is ready to acquire something? And on a related note, you may be wondering, what about the proficiency level of the learners? Well, it's true that novice learners don't tend to notice recasts very much, but it would be dangerous to conclude that you need to do more explicit corrections with novice learners. To me, the last thing a novice learner needs is an explicit correction. Plus, recasts are input providing, and novice learners do need input. And the last factor I'll mention, there's more, but the last one I'll mention is context. It is very different to have participants interacting with a researcher who is giving them recasts targeting one specific form versus the reality of the classroom, where the teacher may be recasting a little bit of everything, where sometimes the teacher may not be providing recasts, and where the learners are engaged in a lot of other things. And that last point to me is crucial. Context. Going back to the quote by Ellis and Sheen about recasts being one type of flower, we need to pick the right flowers for the right occasion. And in some cases, you might not need flowers. We need to consider how the learner is perceiving a recast or perceiving a correction. Sometimes correcting somebody may be demotivating for them. And continuing on with the flower analogy, when you give flowers to somebody, what are you expecting back, if anything? And so when you give feedback to learners, what are you expecting? As we said in other episodes, the main takeaway when it comes to feedback in second language acquisition is curb your expectations. There's still a lot more to unpack, so be sure to subscribe. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.